I didn't think much about the drive home until the turn onto our street. 3 days away had been nothing but conference rooms, polite handshakes, and the quiet pride of knowing I'd done my job well. My head was still replaying moments from the trip, the closing remarks, the firm grip from my boss as he said, "Good work," the unspoken hope that maybe this time it would mean something more for my career. I saw the house before I saw her. The blinds were half drawn, the porch light off, and there, lined up against the curb, were black plastic garbage bags. 6 of them, heavy and sagging, tied at the top like they were holding something that needed to be contained. My mother stood a few feet away from them, arms crossed, weight shifted onto one leg. She wasn't looking at me, not even when my car rolled to a stop at the end of the driveway. Her eyes were fixed somewhere over my shoulder, like she was waiting for a car that wasn't mine. For a moment, I thought maybe she'd been cleaning out the garage. But as I stepped out, the cold air hitting my face, my stomach began to tighten. There was something in the way she kept still, not the stillness of rest, but the kind that comes when you're bracing for someone's reaction. I walked toward her. "What's going on?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes flicked toward the bags, and then back to the street. "Your things," she said, her voice flat. I looked at the bags, at the way they slumped against each other like they'd been dragged out and left there for a while. The one closest to me had a corner of fabric sticking out, a sweater I hadn't worn in months. My sweater. I stepped closer and crouched down, pulling at the knot. Inside was a mess of my life. Books, clothes, a framed photo of me from college graduation. The glass was cracked. I straightened slowly. "You packed my room into garbage bags?" Her arms tightened across her chest. "It needed to be done. While I was gone." She looked at me for the first time then. It was the right time. I didn't know what to say. My mind kept looping back to the fact that I'd been gone for work, not a vacation, not to escape anything, work. And I'd come home to find this. The driveway felt too big between us. The air was damp and heavy, and the only sound was the occasional hum of a car passing at the far end of the street. I wanted to ask her why she hadn't called, why she couldn't have told me this in any way that gave me a chance to prepare. But the words felt pointless before they even left my mouth. I bent down and lifted one of the bags. It was heavier than I expected, the plastic stretching under my grip. The weight was awkward, and I had to shift it against my hip to keep it from tearing. "Where am I supposed to put all this?" I asked. "That's for you to figure out," she said. There was no anger in her voice, no sharpness, just the kind of cold finality that doesn't leave room for negotiation. I wanted to believe there was some misunderstanding, that maybe she was clearing the room for renovations, or that she thought this would help me move forward. But deep down I knew. This wasn't about space. It was about removing me. The thought landed hard in my chest. I set the bag down and tried again. "I don't understand." She glanced at her watch like we were on a schedule I hadn't been told about. "It's better this way." Better for who? The question sat in my throat, but I didn't say it. Because I already knew the answer, and hearing her confirm it would make it harder to stand there. The sky was starting to darken, the clouds pulling tighter. The smell of damp leaves carried across the yard, but it didn't feel like fall. It felt like the end of something else entirely. I picked up another bag and hauled it toward my car. My shoes crunched over the gravel at the edge of the driveway, each step louder than it needed to be. She didn't move to help. Halfway through loading them, I turned back toward her. Was there something I did? Her eyes softened for the briefest second before she looked away. "It's time you had your own place." It might have sounded reasonable if it had come with notice, or kindness, or even a shared plan. But standing there, with the rest of my life in plastic sacks, it just felt like being erased. By the time the last bag was in the trunk, my hands were raw from the plastic cutting into them. She was still in the same spot, arms crossed, expression unreadable. I closed the trunk. The sound echoed down the street. I wanted to say goodbye, but the word didn't fit. Instead, I just nodded, climbed into my car, and started the engine. As I pulled away, I looked in the rearview mirror. She hadn't moved. The bags were gone now, but the space they'd left on the curb seemed larger than it should have been. And in that silence, I knew whatever home had been for me here wasn't anymore. The bags were lined up along the side of the house, the kind you buy when you don't care what they hold. Thick, black, meant to hide things. My name wasn't written on any of them, but I knew they were mine. The shape of them, the way the corners sagged, the small tear in one that revealed the arm of my old sweater. I'd worn that sweater on the train ride home last winter, the trip where I'd brought my mother her favorite tea and a book she'd mentioned months earlier. It had felt like a good visit. Now it was crumpled in a bag that smelled faintly of damp earth. She didn't move when I stepped closer, just kept her arms folded and her gaze somewhere between me and the horizon. I wanted to ask what she thought she was doing, but the question felt too small for the moment. There was a distance in her eyes that didn't belong to this morning. It had been growing for years, maybe decades, and I'd been too far away to notice its shape. I bent down and touched one of the bags. The plastic was warm from the sun, slick against my fingers. It rustled in a way that made me think of all the apartments I'd packed up in my 20s, the sound of leaving behind what no longer fit in my life. But this wasn't me leaving. This was me being removed. She said my name once, flat, like an announcement. Then she told me I couldn't keep living here, as if nothing had changed. Her voice was calm, but it carried something underneath, finality, maybe resentment. I didn't know which one was heavier. The strange thing was, I didn't feel the sharp sting I expected. I felt something slower, heavier. A recognition that this wasn't about the bags or the clothes or even the space I took up in her home. This was about a decision she had already made in her heart long before I turned my key in the front door this morning. I glanced back toward my car, the trunk still half full from the trip. I'd come home tired, hoping for a meal at the kitchen table, maybe a quiet evening. Now, every plan I had dissolved into the air between us. She didn't step closer, didn't offer help, just stood as though her role was to witness, not participate. I thought about asking why now, but part of me knew it didn't matter. There is no version of this conversation that ends with me carrying my bags back inside. So I crouched, untied the first one, and opened it. Inside were layers of my life, shirts folded without care, books with bent covers, framed photos wrapped in towels. She had taken them down from the wall. Each item had been touched by her hands, not with tenderness, but with the efficiency of someone clearing a space. The sound of the plastic shifting felt louder than our silence. I started stacking the bags near the car, each one heavier than it looked. With every trip from the side of the house to the driveway, the reality pressed in deeper. This wasn't a fight we'd recover from. At one point, she told me I could take my time, though her tone suggested she hoped I wouldn't. I didn't answer. My voice felt lodged somewhere low in my chest, as if speaking might shatter the fragile boundary holding us apart. By the third trip, sweat had started to form along my collar. The sun was high, and the air felt too still. I could hear neighbors in the distance, their lives unbroken by whatever this was. I wondered what they might think, seeing me carry my life away in garbage bags while my mother stood nearby like a guard at a threshold. There was no shouting, no slam doors, just the methodical rhythm of lifting, carrying, placing, like I was part of a process neither of us had the power to stop now that it had begun. When I reached for the last bag, I realized it was lighter than the rest. Inside were papers, notebooks, and a single mug wrapped in newspaper. It was the mug I'd bought her years ago, the one with the chip trim she used every morning. I didn't know if she meant to give it back, or if it had been swept in by accident. I didn't ask. I set the bag in the trunk, closed it, and stood for a moment with my hands resting on the warm metal. The house looked the same as when I'd left. A narrow porch, the faded shutters, the wind chime that caught the smallest breeze. But it wasn't mine anymore. Maybe it never had been. When I finally turned toward her, she met my eyes. There was no apology there, no anger either. Just a quiet certainty, like she believed she had done the necessary thing. I nodded once, not in agreement, but as acknowledgement. She didn't return it. The drive away from the house was slower than I intended. I kept glancing in the mirror, watching the roofline sink lower against the sky. I thought about the weight of the bags in my trunk and how little they contained compared to what I was leaving behind. Somewhere between the corner store and the highway, I realized I wasn't going to call her. Not today. Maybe not for a while. Silence felt like the only language that could hold what had just happened. And so I drove, the hum of the road underlining the fact that I no longer had a place to arrive to, only somewhere to go. The weeks after I moved into the studio unfolded like pages in a book I hadn't planned to read. Each day began the same. The hum of traffic below my window, the smell of burnt coffee drifting from the old percolator left by the previous tenant, and the quiet knowledge that no one expected me to come downstairs for breakfast anymore. At first, the freedom felt like an open sky. I could come and go without reporting to anyone, eat cereal for dinner, or stay up until dawn watching films on the cracked laptop I'd brought with me. But the novelty faded quickly, replaced by something quieter, heavier, a constant background hum of questions I couldn't answer. I told myself it was fine, that this was what independence looked like. But in truth, the walls of the studio seemed to breathe with my unease. The landlord's footsteps in the hall made me tense. The sound of a neighbor's keys in the lock reminded me how thin the boundaries were here. I had gone from too many rules to none at all, and I was beginning to see that both came with their own kind of loneliness. On Sundays, I find myself walking past my parents' house without meaning to. I would slow down as I reached the driveway, my eyes searching for signs of life. My father's truck, my mother's roses, the upstairs window where light used to spill out in the evenings. Sometimes I saw shadows moving inside. Sometimes I imagined they were looking out at me, wondering why I didn't come in. But they never called, and I never knocked. It wasn't that I thought they'd change their minds. It was that I couldn't yet make sense of what had happened. One day I had been their daughter. The next, I was a guest turned intruder. The speed of it still made my chest ache. Kevin called once. His voice on the line was careful, as if each word had to pass through a filter. "Mom's been quieter," he said. "Quieter. Not angry. Just different. She's in the garden a lot." I didn't know what to do with that information. Part of me wanted to ask if she ever talked about me, but I swallowed the question. Some answers, I decided, were worse than not knowing. At work, I kept my head down. The thrift store wasn't glamorous, but it gave my days shape. Sorting clothes, pricing items, arranging displays. It was methodical, predictable. There was comfort in the repetition. Customers rarely asked about my life, and when they did, I kept my answers short. But one afternoon, as I was restocking a shelf of chipped mugs, a woman in her 60s stopped me. "You're Leah, aren't you?" she asked, tilting her head. "Yes," I said slowly. "I thought so. I know your mother. She speaks very highly of her garden, you know." Her smile was warm, but the air between us shifted. I realized she was offering me a thread, thin, but real, back to the life I'd left. I thanked her, made some polite comment about the weather, and moved on. But the conversation lingered like the smell of rain on concrete. At night, I began writing in a notebook I'd found in the store's donation bin. It was meant to be a ledger, its pages lined with neat columns for numbers, but I ignored the structure and filled it with words instead. Not essays or stories, just fragments. Memories of the house. Things I wished I'd said. Questions I couldn't voice out loud. One entry read, "What if love is just the time before someone decides you failed them?" Another, "Would they have done this if I had been different? Or did they do this because they believed I could survive it?" I didn't share the notebook with anyone. It wasn't meant to be read. It was the only place where I could be honest without consequence. The first snow came early that year. I watched it from my window, the flakes catching in the glow of the streetlights, settling over the parked cars in a clean white layer. It struck me how silent it was, how something could change the entire landscape without a single sound. I thought about my mother then, about the way she used to bake bread on winter mornings, the kitchen filling with heat and the smell of yeast. About how she would cut the first slice for me, butter melting into the soft center. The memory was so vivid I could almost taste it. But just as quickly, another image replaced it. Her standing in the driveway, arms crossed, watching me load my life into black plastic bags. That moment had no warmth in it, no softness, and I realized I had been carrying both versions of her with me, the mother who cared and the mother who turned me away, without knowing which one was real. The truth, I suspected, was that they were both her. And maybe they were both me too, the daughter who belonged and the one who didn't. As the snow deepened outside, I closed the curtains and sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the radiator hiss. I didn't feel strong yet. I didn't feel healed. But for the first time, I felt something steadier than the ache, a kind of quiet resolve, like the ground settling after an earthquake. I didn't know what came next, but I knew it would be mine to decide. The first weeks passed in a haze of repetition. Wake up, brew tea, sit by the window, watch the parking lot below slowly fill with cars as other people's days began in places they belonged. But little by little, my routine bent toward something else. It started with a flyer taped to the mailbox in the lobby. Local community garden needs volunteers. I almost ignored it. Gardening had been something I once loved in another life, back when we had a backyard I could call mine. I had left that behind like everything else. Still, the next Saturday, I found myself there, hands awkward in borrowed gloves, the air smelling faintly of turned earth. I didn't speak much to the other volunteers. They didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. We worked side by side in a quiet that wasn't heavy. That felt like something. I began stopping at the library on the way back. At first it was to warm up, but soon I found myself bringing home books again. Not just cookbooks or easy distractions, but histories, essays, even a battered poetry collection that seemed to put words to thoughts I'd been carrying but couldn't name. Small acts of care began to slip into my life in ways I didn't plan. I replaced the cracked mug I'd been using with one that fit my hand just right. I bought a second blanket for the bed. I started cooking meals that took more than one pot and more than 10 minutes, eating them at the table instead of over the sink. The work at the shop was still monotonous, but I no longer counted the hours until I could leave. I'd noticed the way sunlight pooled on the counter in late afternoon, or the strange satisfaction of aligning rows of products until they looked deliberate. It wasn't joy. Not yet. But it was movement, small, almost invisible shifts in how the days felt as they passed. Some evenings, I'd walk past lit windows of houses, catching glimpses of people's lives. A family setting the table, someone reading on a couch, a man crouched to tie a child's shoe. I used to turn away quickly, the sight of it too sharp to bear. Now I lingered a moment longer before moving on. The garden plots began to change with the season. Shoots pushed through soil, fragile but insistent. There was something almost defiant in the way they reached for light without hesitation. I caught myself leaning in close, fingers brushing the leaves, surprised at how alive they felt. By the end of that first month, I realized I had gone 3 whole days without thinking about the night I left home. Not because it had vanished, I still carried it, but because it had loosened its grip just enough for other thoughts to take root. And in that quiet space between what was gone and what might come, I began to believe, faintly, that I could grow here too. It began as a sound, faint, almost imperceptible, the low hum of an approaching memory. At first, Lena thought it was the refrigerator in the kitchen, the one she had learned to ignore. But then the sound took shape, and she realized it wasn't in the house at all. It was in her chest. A tightness that had been sleeping for weeks began to stir. It was early evening, and the sky had that thin, dim light that made the walls feel closer. She was washing the single plate she'd used for dinner when the phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She hesitated, her hand frozen under the stream of warm water, eyes fixed on the glowing digits. She told herself not to answer, that nothing good had ever come from unknown numbers, but the sound kept drilling into the small kitchen until it felt louder than her own pulse. She picked it up. "Lena!" The voice on the other end was soft but too familiar. It had a way of collapsing the air between them, as if no time had passed. She swallowed. "Yes." There was a pause, too long to be casual, too short to be deliberate. "It's me." She didn't need the name. The inflection was enough. The same voice that had been in her head the day she walked away, the same voice that knew how to press its weight into her until she bent. Her grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want?" "I heard about your situation," the voice said, not without a trace of something she couldn't quite name. Not pity, not concern. Something sharper, like curiosity wrapped in silk. She closed her eyes, pressing her free hand against the counter for balance. "That's none of your business. I just thought you might need help." Help. The word landed like a stone in her stomach. She almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat. "From you." Another pause, heavier this time. "Things don't have to be difficult for you, Lena." They never did. It was too much, the old patterns, the soft threats that weren't quite threats. She felt the walls of the kitchen closing in, the faint smell of soap and warm water turning into something suffocating. She hung up before she could hear another word. The silence afterward was not a relief. It was a hollow, ringing kind of silence, the kind that made her aware of every small sound her body made, the steady inhale, the uneven exhale, the quick shuffle of her feet across the floor. She sat at the small kitchen table, her hands pressed flat against the wood. It had been weeks since she'd allowed herself to think of the past in any concrete way. She'd been careful, moving slowly, rebuilding small routines, morning walks, simple meals, evenings with books instead of television. They had been quiet, almost safe. And now, with a single call, she felt the ground shift. Her first instinct was to retreat, to close the blinds, to shut the phone off, to shrink her world back to something no one could enter. But the thought of doing that brought a different kind of ache. Because she knew what would follow, the isolation, the slow erosion of the fragile hope she'd been nursing. She stood, moving to the sink again, letting the warm water run over her fingers until they stung. She watched the steam curl upward, soft and shapeless. There was a part of her, a small, stubborn part, that refused to let this be the moment she unraveled. She dried her hands and went to the living room. The evening light had shifted to a deeper gray, shadows climbing the walls. She lit a candle on the low table, not for light, but for the act itself. The flame caught slowly, wavering before holding steady. She sat down on the couch, drawing a blanket over her legs. It wasn't comfort, not entirely, but it was an anchor, something she could choose, something that belonged to her. She thought of the voice on the phone, of the way it had pulled her backward without warning. She let herself feel the pull, but she did not follow it. Instead, she thought of the list she'd made last week, small things she wanted to try in the coming months. Learn to cook something new. Visit the library. Take the bus to the next town over just to see something unfamiliar. They weren't grand ambitions, but they were hers. And now, more than ever, she needed them. The tension didn't leave her that night. It lingered, threading through her thoughts even as she tried to read. But somewhere in that quiet, she realized that the test wasn't in avoiding these moments, it was in surviving them without losing herself. When she finally turned off the light, the candle still burned on the table. She let it stay, the soft glow brushing the edges of the room. She lay in bed, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator again. This time, it didn't sound like a warning. It sounded like the house breathing with her. Morning arrived without ceremony. The first thing she noticed was the pale, almost colorless light slipping between the blinds. It had rained in the night. She could smell the faint metallic tang of wet pavement through the open window. For a few moments, she lay still, listening to the muffled hum of the city waking up. Somewhere below, a car door slammed. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked twice and was quiet again. She thought about yesterday, the sharpness of it, the way a few words had cut into her, reopening places she thought had healed. The sensation was still there, faintly raw, but different now. It didn't feel like an open wound anymore. More like a scar she had finally touched without flinching. She got up slowly, making coffee without rush, letting the quiet movements of her hands ground her. The kettle's whistle rose and faded, and she poured the water over the coffee grounds in a slow, steady stream. Watching the steam curl upward, she realized she wasn't rehearsing what she would say to anyone. She wasn't playing through arguments in her head. That absence felt almost foreign, like setting down a heavy object you've been holding so long you forgot what your hands felt like, empty. By the time she sat at the small kitchen table, the mug was warm between her palms, and outside the street was streaked with soft sunlight breaking through the last threads of cloud. She sipped, and in that pause, something shifted. It wasn't joy exactly, but it was a recognition that she could choose what weight she carried forward. After breakfast, she pulled on her jacket and stepped outside. The air was cool, damp from the rain. Her shoes made faint dark prints on the sidewalk that disappeared as they dried. She turned toward the small park 3 blocks over, a place she'd walked past dozens of times without entering. Today she went in. The grass glistened faintly. A few people were scattered across the benches, most of them reading or staring at nothing in particular. She followed the narrow path toward the pond at the center, where a pair of ducks moved in slow circles, unbothered by anything. She sat on a bench and simply watched. The world moved at a manageable pace here, leaves shifting in the breeze, ripples traveling across the water, the quiet creak of branches above. Her breathing began to match that slower rhythm. She thought about all the years she'd measured herself against expectations that had nothing to do with her own voice. How much of her life had been spent adjusting to fit into someone else's frame? That thought could have carried bitterness, but it didn't. Not today. Today it felt more like turning over a stone and seeing, finally, what had been living underneath it. She stayed until the sun reached higher, warming the top of her head. When she stood, she felt something solid in her. Not loud, not triumphant, but steady. Back home, she opened the closet and began sorting through the things that had been lingering there. Clothes she hadn't worn in years, paper she didn't need, keepsakes she'd held onto out of obligation rather than affection. She moved slowly, but each choice was deliberate. The pile by the door grew, and with it came a strange lightness. In the afternoon, she called the community center. Her voice was calm when she asked about volunteering, even though she hadn't spoken to them in years. The woman on the other end sounded warm, even surprised, and they arranged a time for her to visit. She didn't tell herself this was a grand reinvention. It was just a next step, but for the first time, that was enough. As evening settled, she made tea and stood by the window, watching the lights blink on in the buildings across the street. Each small window was its own private world, and she thought about how many quiet turning points might be happening behind those glass panes right now, unseen, unmarked, but still real. Her phone buzzed once with a message from someone she hadn't heard from in months. She read it, smiled faintly, and put the phone down without answering right away. She would reply later, when the words felt honest, not reflexive. The steam from her tea rose in soft spirals. Somewhere deep inside, the tension that had knotted her for so long loosened another fraction. She knew it might never vanish completely. Maybe it wasn't meant to. But she could live alongside it without letting it dictate every step. The rain began again just before nightfall, light at first, then steadier. She left the window open an inch so the sound could come in. It layered itself over the hum of the city, over her own measured breathing. When she finally turned off the light and lay down, she didn't feel the need to plan tomorrow. That, she realized, was the quietest victory of all. Not the absence of difficulty, but the ability to rest without bracing for impact. And in that stillness, she understood, she hadn't erased the past. She had simply stopped letting it carry her away. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment your country below.